Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sherzod Muminov. I am Associate Professor in Japanese History. I will be chairing the academic part, and I will be timing everybody to make sure that we have enough time left towards the end for some discussion. You've just watched the trailer. Can I just, out of curiosity, a show of hands of people who've watched Grave of the Fireflies? Okay, so not everybody has watched. So we will try not to spoil it for those who haven't watched. But please do when you have a moment. Just a very, very quick introduction to the film. You saw also in the trailer, written, directed by Takahata Isao, animated by Studio Ghibli in 1988, based on Nosaka Kiyuki's semi-autobiographical novel by the same name, Grave of the Fireflies, which he wrote based on his sister's death. And basically, he confessed that it was written out of his sense of guilt, survivor's guilt, that he he really tried to save his sister, but because food was short, he was eating more than her, and he felt guilty, and he had to write it. So I won't, as I said, spoil it, but the academic part of this event is to it has two main goals. The most important, the primary goal is to talk about Japanese studies at the UEA. So each of us are going to make about a 10-minute presentation talking about our research and teaching and what we do here at the UEA. And if you're not taking one of our classes, and if there's still time for you in your studies, this is also to encourage you to take our classes, but maybe also to spend more time doing Japanese studies here or elsewhere. And the second goal is to, in a way, to relate to the trailer, to the film, to talk about how the film illuminates our work in terms of our research, our teaching, and what clues it gives us about Japanese history, Japanese literature, Japanese art history, and just Japanese studies in general. So without further ado, I will now start introducing my colleagues one by one. So our first speaker, my colleague, Dr. Eriko Tomizawa-Kay, has already been introduced, the Sainsbury Institute Associate Professor in Japanese Art History and the Director of the Center for Japanese Studies. Eriko, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Today, I'd like to explore how Japanese artists have reflected on the war and the peace, from the battle painting on the 1970s to the quiet mourning found in post-war art and animation, especially in the graves of the Fireflies. Art gives us a way to see how a nation remembers, questions, and transform its experience of war. It can serve power, but it can also help us understand loss and imagine peace. So during the Asia-Pacific War, many Japanese artists created large-scale battle scenes commissioned by the states. These paints celebrated nation victory and the spirit of sacrifice. Here we see Divine Soldier's Descent on Palembang, painted by Tsuruta Goro in 1942. It showed a paratrooper landing in Sumatra during one of the Japan's early victories. The sky is bright, the parachute float like a cloud, and the composition feel almost peaceful. Yet, beneath this beauty lies the reality of war. Tsuruta and other wartime painters used Western-style realism and dramatic composition to convey a scene of destiny and discipline. Their technical mastery was remarkable, and their works reflect how deeply art was connected with the idea of the time. This next painting, Meeting with Generals Yamashita and Percival by Miyamoto Saburo, recorded the surrender of Singapore. It's based on the photograph but transformed into something monumental. General Yamashita sits calmly at the center and portrayed with a quiet dignity rather than dominance. The light falls more strongly on the British officers, whose faces show the strain and the fatigue, while the Japanese seat remains in a restrained tone of shadow and discipline. The drooping flag behind them marks the solemnity of the moment. Miyamoto turned the documentary scene into the drama of compose and mutual tension, displaying a Great East Asia War art exhibition. The work combined realism with a sense of historical gravity, showing how art can shape memory as much as it's recorded. While Miyamoto painting depict victory, Fujita Tsuguharu's Battle of Arts convey the tragedy. It's portrayed the final battle in the Aleutian Island, where almost all Japanese soldiers died. The entire surface is filled with soldiers, no horizon, no sky, no hero. The soldiers and the earth merge into one dark, tangled mass of the red and brown. It feels chaotic, yet almost rhythmic, like a tragic symphony. At the time, many people called it Fujita's wartime masterpiece. He seemed to believe that even death could be expressed through beauty. Seen today, it's revealed the deep sadness of war and they remind us how artists struggled to find meaning in such tragedy. It shows how aesthetic power can both convey and question human experience. 2 years later, Fujita completed Honoring the Face of Our Comrades on Saipan, one of his last wartime works. It was created to honor loyalty and self-sacrifice. The scene showed soldiers and civilians at the end of battle, some dying, others preparing for suicide. At first it looks solemn and heroic, but the longer we look, the more we feel its desperation. The muted color of red and brown suggested both earth and blood. For Fujita, this may have been an attempt to express purity of spirit. From our perspective today, it also reflects the sorrow and exhaustion of war. The painting stands as a visual record of a nation facing the end of long and difficult conflict. After the war, Japanese artists began to consider how to depict conflict. Iri and Toshi Maruki painted the Battle of Okinawa in 1984 following their Hiroshima panel series from the 1950s and 1960s. Here there are no heroes, only ordinary people caught in chaos. Swirling lines and the colors suggest fire, water, and blood. The figures are distorted by grief and fear, not by triumph. The Maruki sought not to glorify sacrifice, but to witness human suffering. Their painting combined traditional Japanese ink techniques with modern emotional expression. In this way, they transform art into an act of empathy, a visual language for memory and peace. In Grave of the Firefly, the word hotaru carried two meanings, written as this hotaru. It means a firefly, the fragile light of life. Hotaru, it means a falling fire, evoking the fire bombs that destroyed Japanese cities. Takahata Isao connected these meanings throughout the film. The light of the firefly becomes a link between life and death, between tenderness and loss. It's a quite metaphor for remembrance, how light can fold both beauty and the pain. This idea of dual meaning also appeared in Okinawan art, where natural imagery often express both vitality and tragedy. We will see the most powerful in the work of Gima Hiroshi. This is Dragonfly by Gima Hiroshi, created in 1979. Unlike the fireflies in Takahata's film, this image will convey not beauty but fear. A woman carrying a child, and another child flee before a huge dragonfly that pursues them through the air. The hash red and the yellow suggest the flames of an air raid, and the cropped frame leaves the figures trapped with no escape. The child looks directly out at us, appealing for help. The dragonfly symbolizes a fighter plane, but Gima leaves its nationality uncertain. This ambiguity reflects how civilians suffered deeply in the crossfire between opposing forces. Through this image, Gima gives voice to those whose stories were often left untold. Dragonfly is not an image of reconciliation, but a powerful reminder of how art can bear witness to suffering and survival. Across these works, from Fujita's wartime paintings to the Maruki and the Gima's post-war art and the Takahata's animation, we can see how Japanese artists have grappled with the legacy of war. The early paintings express themes of victory and loyalty, while later works focused on loss, empathy, and reflection. Art cannot change the past, but it can help us to remember it with understanding and compassion. It invites reflection rather than judgment, empathy rather than pride. By transforming sorrow into understanding, these artists remind us that the role of art is not to celebrate war, but to help us remember why peace is precious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eriko. Perfect timing, 9 minutes, 28 seconds. The next speaker is Dr. Hannah Osborne, who is a Japan Foundation lecturer in Japanese literature.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all this evening.
There's a mic there. Yeah.
There we are. Okay. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about essentially what I do here at UEA, and also to respond a little bit to Hotaru no Haka, or Grave of the Fireflies. I think before I launch into what I sort of teach, I'll just take a few moments to respond to the trailer that we saw initially. And say, so obviously, as it has been introduced already by Sherzod, and as we've heard Eriko mention, Hotaru no Haka, Grave of the Fireflies, is an animated film and created by Takahata Isao. It's based on Nosaka Akiyuki's short story, actually, of the same title. The story is set, as we saw, in Kobe in 1945, so right at the end of the Second World War, and recounts the tragic experience of two young Japanese siblings, Seita and Setsuko, who survived the incendiary air raid that destroys their home and kills their parents towards the end of the war. And I suppose I will, I'm tempted to mention the ending, but I won't. I'll leave it for you to find out. Well, this year has marked the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and you have probably been part of, or at the very least seen and known about events this year which memorialize the war. But you might be questioning also whether such memorialization is important, and even whether that war, which is so sort of distant now in our history, is still relevant to us. Indeed, any surviving veterans with living memories of the war will be approaching their centenaries. And those born during the war, like my dad, whose earliest memories are of playing in the bombed out shelters and growing up in that war's aftermath, are reaching a grand old age. However, talking to my dad, as I'm sure many of you talk to older relatives, it's sort of increasingly clear to me, and through my teaching, not only how the war shaped his life and the lives of his generation, but how it has been significant in ways which we don't really even realize in shaping our own generation, socially, culturally, and its significance to our culture can be felt in the present moment. And I will talk, when I talk about my teaching, about the ways in which we see this. So certainly the Second World War has been no less formative in Japan, as Grave of Fireflies, I think, demonstrates. Both the writer of the short story, Nosaka Akiyuki, and the director of the animated film, Takata Isao, were childhood survivors of the incendiary air raids on Japan, which the animation shows. They both faced situations of total war and destruction during which they lost their parents. And Nosaka lost his 1.5 years old sister, who died of starvation after the air raids. Takahata, the director's sister, became separated from him and was badly scarred and burned in a raid. So both Nosaka's short story, which was published in 1967, and Takahata's animated film, which is based on the story and was released in 1988, drew much attention as well as acclaim at the time of their release. Which is kind of interesting because they were released at various stages, so 67 and 88 after the war. And both have continued to divide the readership and audiences in their responses. So while many, both Japanese and non-Japanese, old and young, male and female, are brought to tears by it, some empathize with the 14-year-old Seita, and others blame him for the death of Setsuko. Still others outside of Japan have claimed that the film perpetuates a post-war Japanese master narrative of victimhood. Surely also viewers in Japan have said that it tells a falsehood because Seita survives in it to tell the tale. So, but another way of looking at it, however, is that cultural narratives, whether through literature or animation, allow us to work through historical traumas. The events of the Second World War, where machines, planes, and bombs were used to bomb civilians, women and children, to erase cities and reduce them to rubble in our own countries, inflicted a historic trauma on us. And working through such traumas allows us not only to mourn and grieve our losses, but enables us to realize why we are how we are, politically, culturally, socially, individually. It enables a critique of all these aspects of our identity and can lead us to transformative socio-political practice so that we not only learn from history through our retelling of it, but we are able to heal from it. Japan's own government, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, established itself as a peaceful nation and wanted, in many ways, in its public discourse, to cover over the uncomfortable narratives of war, to focus on the future and not to focus on violence and killing, to distance themselves from those actions. But many artists and writers, most prominent artists and writers in the post-World War period in Japan resisted this, and they continued, like Nosaka and Takahata, to speak of the horrors, the pain, and the losses of war. So in my modules, as I will show you, we look at many stories which similarly disrupt the narrative of post-war peace. A narrative of peace relies on our forgetting and not remembering the violence of war. And it is interesting that during World War II, Japan framed its various incursions into other countries through the terms of peace. They were not at war. They were creating the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. Today, other nations similarly insist on their actions as peaceful or peace-seeking when it is clear that they are asking us to overlook complicity in violence. So fiction which asks us to remember the pain of others brings the effect of that pain into the present moment and allows its significance to speak to us.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next presenter is Dr. Ra Mason, Sasakawa, Associate Professor of International Relations and Japanese Foreign Policy.
So basically, I'm going to talk about international relations of Japan and how this relates to Hotaru no Haka, Grave of the Fireflies. Also, of course, I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Eriko for organizing and Sherzod for chairing, and to my colleagues. I was also particularly pleased that Eriko mentioned the dragonfly from Gima Hiroshi. And I've literally just arrived back this morning from Okinawa, so I may be a little bit kind of fading compared to how I might usually be after traveling for 48 hours. But it struck me because as I was walking along the coastline just 2 days ago, where the bombings took place on Okinawa, which has actually been the coastline has been reconfigured because of the bombings. It's a buzz with dragonflies everywhere. And to me, what Hotaru no Haka symbolizes more than anything is the difference between war and peace and how fine a line that is. If you can walk along the coastline and see the dragonflies 2 days ago in Okinawa, it's pure peace. It is pure peace. And there could be nothing more tranquil and beautiful than that scene. But yet, in the worst times, when Okinawa was turned into a hell on earth, suddenly that would transform the meaning and the interpretation of those beautiful little beasts. So I think, Grave of the Fireflies sums that up brilliantly, because it's a film that is just so delicately made, and it talks to us also as international relations specialists about the gap between the international, the national, which leads to these wars taking place, and then the individual and the impacts that has on the individual. So a really, really kind of important and transformative film. So it also kind of speaks to the gap between what you might think of as realism and idealism. So the ideas that are carried under a national flag, and then the reality that leads to. So one of the things that we teach about when we talk about Japan's international relations is not so much blaming Japan for this or praising Japan for that, but rather about some of the incidents that sort of symbolize that transformation. So particularly thinking about the great the great Kanto earthquake and the destruction of democracy and fledgling ideals about joining a better world, and then the kind of way in which particular individuals are persecuted and targeted as a result of that. And that's obviously something which is very topical to current affairs at the time. So Japan's experiences are extremely important in that respect in terms of understanding international relations today. Also, the way in which Japan has this experience of expanding and then kind of contracting and collapsing. And there's a lesson here about how, as you can see from the map, you can go from dominating one of the largest surface areas in history to suddenly capitulating and becoming the victim of horrendous incendiary bombings like we see in Hotaru no Haka, nuclear warfare, and the kind of economic and social destruction that goes with that. So the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, again, as was mentioned, is partly envisaging peace, really, but it becomes transformed into this monstrous sort of intangible beast that dominates the region. But what comes from that, and again, this is what we try and teach in the modules, is actually the emergence of a kind of reinvention and a rejuvenation. And what we see is the alliance system. So from the perspective of Japan, it's transformed from being this adversary, particularly to the Allied powers and specifically the United States, to suddenly the greatest of allies. And this all comes under a US occupation, which itself is in some respects quite benevolent relative to that total warfare that we talked about, that we see in Grave of the Fireflies. And the policies were quite comprehensive in transforming that. So one of the things that it's important to sort of learn about by focusing on Japanese studies is to see how its relations created contemporary Japan. And particularly you have the famous US drafted pacifist constitution with Article 9 and its prevention of war. And then also, of course, the projection of power from the Southwest Islands, and particularly Okinawa, which is something I tend to focus on a lot. And the way in which this is codified and contained in political relations. So the politics is really a cover for lots of these very fundamental things at the economic and social level, which transform Japan. And if you wanted to take away, I mean, this is a bit gimmicky because it's academia, so it's, you know, academics love threes. But we've got the Korean War. So people, when you're thinking about Japan and the Japanese miracle and the transformation of Japan, really, I would say the things that you have to not omit, right? Things you have to focus on, at least partly. The Korean War, because it drove the demand. So this is how Japan's economy grows. Land reform, because this is what created a market in Japan. You can learn more about that from all of us, I think, actually. My colleagues will teach you that. And the way in which Japan played this key role in the Cold War, right? So Japan forms this key bastion, this unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. But when we're talking about Japan, we're also, in the same way that in Grave of the Fireflies, you saw these very different experiences, also geographically, it's very different. So if you're talking about Okinawa, you're not really examining the same kinds of experiences. So I try in the modules to teach about Okinawa as an example of diversity and difference within this body that we call Japan. And you can see this illustrated very blatantly in the pink areas, which are all still US military bases today. So one of the areas I look at is protest and governance, and in particular, these sort of heinous incidents. So you have this supposedly benevolent alliance, but again, the way in which individuals are victimized is very striking. So whether that be through robbery and rape and pollution, or whether it be through this kind of structural power that controls the lives of individuals. And as we've seen through a number of incidents, this probably being the most famous back in 2004, when push comes to shove, this was the case of an American military helicopter crashing into Okinawa International University. The area becomes dominated by power, right, by physical power. And in this particular case, although it was a university campus, just like our own here at UEA, if you can imagine a helicopter crashing into it, thankfully it hasn't happened yet. You can see the impact, but also the fact that at the end of this, it was not Japanese authorities that administered the crash site, it was American authorities. And so you still have this power imbalance within the alliance. And that reflects, I think, the power imbalance that we see in the film. So hopefully that gives you a little taste of the kind of things that I try and teach about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ra. And again, very good timing. Everyone has been very good with timing today. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Nadine Willems, who is Associate Professor in Japanese History.
Okay. Sorry. So I'm very happy to be here. And I must confess that my teaching focuses usually on the pre-war or certainly the early 20th century. So I'm not a war expert. What I like to teach about, however, is the experience of ordinary people, and particularly what kind of voices do they have, and I'd say what kind of agency do ordinary people have, particularly in the case of these people being tossed by forces that are completely impossible to oppose, and what kind of resilience do they have? What kind of options do they have to make their voices heard? So I take this opportunity of the grave of the Fireflies to talk about these children. I mean, these children as victims of war. Children are the most vulnerable, the most helpless. What can they do? Well, during the war, certainly nothing. And this movie perfectly illustrates that helplessness and vulnerability. And I think it's a very inspiring in a way, because it makes you think of that situation of these children who are hungry. And this is a story of survival. But I think that it's important to, as a historian, to look at the context. And the context is about the aerial bombing of cities. And I think it's important to go back a little bit in time. The movie is taking place, or the story takes place in 1945. This is when Japan is being bombed by the US forces, mainly all over the country. There are incendiary bombs, so it creates an enormous amount of devastation, and the number of victims is very high. But it must be said that the bombing of civilians, the aerial bombing, started before the First World War. The First World War, we see the expansion of these bombings of cities. These examples are not the whole story. There are many more examples, but I think that by the Second World War, certainly this has become almost customary to bomb cities and target civilians. Or originally, civilians are only casual or incidental damage of these bombings, but by the end of the Second World War, they are primary targets, because the idea is to suppress the morale of these civilians. So this is a terrible story, really. Guernica during the Spanish Civil War is when the global attention is being alerted to this bombing of civilians. But you have also in 1937 the bombing of Shanghai, the Blitz, of course, in Britain, Dresden in Germany, Tokyo, March 1945, more than 94,000 people killed because of these incendiary bombings. And the bombing of Kobe, which is where the story relates to, is of course one of those bombing of Japanese cities during the Second World War. So bombing of civilians has become almost natural, almost normality during the war. And of course, we jump then we slide into this nuclear bombing, which is even more terrifying, because the technical means have expanded so much that in Hiroshima, about 140,000 people are killed either immediately or in the next few months. And Nagasaki also over 74,000. So this slide of conventional bombing into nuclear bombing makes the story even more terrible. And I just mentioned here Barefoot Gen, because this is another example of this manga or animation. It has been turned into an animation movie, which is a document about this nuclear bombing in this case, which you may be interested in. So we're going to talk about the atomic bomb survivors. They are called the hibakusha. And the question, how can they make their voices heard? What kind of agency do they have? Well, the answer is right after the war, not much, because they are basically being forgotten, despite the terrible health effects that they had for the nuclear bombings, skin damage, skin burns, cancer, leukemia, and so forth. In the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombings, you have censorship by the Supreme Command of the Allied Powers about the effects of radiation. The medical reports are confiscated. No public criticism is allowed. So this is a problem, of course, for these people who want to have their stories heard. But also within Japan, there is some kind of ostracization of the atomic bomb victims, because there is a fear of contagion, and basically because no medical reports is circulating, nobody really knows what the effects can be. And there is also the idea that the Japanese want to turn a page after the war and think about something else. But almost luckily, there's the Lucky Dragon number 5 incident, where nuclear testing by the US in the Pacific has the effect of a nuclear fallout on a crew of a ship, a fishing ship, and they are all victims of acute radiation sickness for weeks and months. One of them dies. And the result of this is that there's a new awareness about these nuclear bombings and the possibility of nuclear bombings. And that after 1954, in Japan, there are new initiatives in order to make these dangers of nuclear war more obvious. And so there's the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum that is founded in 1955, the Japan Council Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs in 1955, the Hidankyo, so the Japan Confederations of and Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers Organizations, founded in 1956. And so forth. There are several organizations. I'm going to talk very briefly now about this Hidankyo, the Japan Confederations of Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers Organizations, because they are an example of this non-state action, non-state initiative, and the agency that normal, ordinary people can have in order to try to change the course of history, really. These people of Hidankyo, they are mostly hibakusha, though some that have survived the atomic bombs. They lobbied the Japanese government for support of the victims. They lobbied the governments worldwide for the abolition of nuclear weapons. This is an organization that has recorded thousands and thousands of testimonies of nuclear bomb victims. They have traveled overseas numerous times. They have lobbied with the United Nations. All of this without being necessarily support or in agreement with their own government, because the Japanese government, because of the alliance, the US security alliance with the US, doesn't really support the entire abolition of nuclear weapons the way these Hidankyo would like to see it. So they lobby for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the end of nuclear war. It is a relentless task. And as you have seen, they've gone through the obstacles put in their ways. The obstacles are the censorship first, and then the willingness of the Japanese perhaps not to talk about the war anymore, the willingness of the Japanese, or the need for the Japanese government to be clear with to be in the alliance with the US security alliance. So these people have made their voices heard. One result is the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize that they received in 2024. And this is following the signature of a treaty for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Of course, that not everyone signed, but it is still a treaty that was negotiated and agreed on in 2017, and that really marked the success for a world free of nuclear weapons that these people have worked for. So this is what I'd like to talk about, the voice of ordinary people and what they can do. Thank you.
The next speaker is me, so I'll have to manage my own time now. Hopefully won't take too long. In this presentation, I would like to talk about my research and partly briefly about my teaching, more about my research, and with a focus on victimhood of children in Japan's War and Peace, and towards the end also very briefly provide some critical outlook or historians' critique of the Grave of the Fireflies. So those of you who've seen the film will notice that Setsuko, the 5-year-old little girl, is wearing this hood, which is called Bosaizukin, which, I mean, it's a bit of a mouthful if you translate it. It's like disaster prevention hood, which was worn by children during the war. And I mean, it does look cute, and obviously the way it's drawn, it's really kind of, I mean, the whole film is really does pull on your heartstrings. It's incredible. I confess I cry every time I see it. I really cry my heart out, and I don't. I mean, I can't help but cry. And I think towards the end of my presentation, I'm going to mention how these symbols, the symbols of the images of children, can also be used for certain purposes. But when I look at this Bosaizukin, I think about another little girl who is wearing it, and this little girl's image is on the front cover of this book called Okori Jizo. Those of you who are familiar with Japan, you will know what Jizo-sama, who Jizo-sama is. Can you raise a hand if you know who Jizo-sama is? So this is basically, I don't know, like some people will say guardian angel. I don't know how correct that is. More like a bodhisattva who is responsible, or who is a guardian or a protector of the deceased children and who guides them to afterlife. And in Japan, you see statues of Jizo-sama almost everywhere with little red kind of, what would you call them? They're not like aprons, like, and this is a story by Yamaguchi Yuko, and when Jizo-sama, who usually had this very serene and calm face, became very angry at the suffering of the children of Hiroshima. Yamaguchi Yuko herself was a survivor of Hiroshima bombing, and the person who illustrated it was a self-taught Hiroshiman artist by the name of Shikoku Goro. And I have actually been doing research on Shikoku Goro. And if you look at some of the things that he painted, you see that this little girl, and if you remember this face, actually is recurring in other works too. So here is another image from Hiroshima, and some of you might also know this very kind of eerie image of a shadow. And that shadow is of a person who was evaporated in one instant when the nuclear blast happened while sitting at the stone stairs of the Sumitomo Bank building in central Hiroshima. So you see that the same little girl, we don't know who this is. We don't know if he modeled it on his daughter, but this is just an image I feel of childhood and of innocent victimhood. If you look very closely, you can see that the little girl has some tears in her eyes. So Shikoku himself was a Hiroshiman. He lost a family member. Like most Hiroshimans, he lost someone, a beloved person, his younger brother, who was very close to him, who was his who also painted, and they painted together. And when Shikoku Goro went to the war, went to the front, they promised to each other that if Shikoku Goro actually comes back, then Naoto, his brother, they would paint together. Unfortunately, Naoto, who is also a soldier towards the end of the war, and who is stationed in Hiroshima, not too far from Ground Zero, dies of his wounds on the 28th of August, 22 days after the bombing. So the children are ubiquitous in his paintings. So you can see this little girl here, which is from the painting called Kuroyame, by Black Rain. And Black Rain is also a theme that comes up in Grave of the Fireflies. And anybody who's read about bombing, nuclear bombing or conventional bombing, or especially the war generation in Japan actually knows this term black rain, the rain that comes after the bombing. So Shikoku, partly through his experience as a Hiroshiman and partly also through his illustrations and the fact that he was a self-taught artist, he didn't have money to go to an art school, so he would copy the old Japanese masters, Hiroshige and others. And he did become almost as symbolic of or kind of representative of the hibakusha. For example, he illustrated not just Okorijizo, but also other stories or testimonies. So Takahashi Akihiro's schoolboy story, which is about the day of the blast, he also illustrated. He also painted a lot of images of a peaceful Japan. As you can see, he's demonstrating here a calendar with his image of a happy mother with 2 young children. Interestingly, on the day of the blast, he was not in Hiroshima. He was actually on the way to Siberia. So he was a Japanese POW in Soviet Union. And in my attempt to talk about the transnational impact of Japanese victimhood, I'm leaving Japan now briefly and to talk about this Turkish poet, Turkish communist poet who was called actually romantic communist, Nazım Hikmet. So Nazım wrote a lot of poems, and Nazım is how he's known mostly in Turkey by his first name. He wrote a lot of poems about Japan, partly because he was also a peace poet. He was also kind of a peace activist, just like Shikoku Goro. And one of his poems, I mean, he wrote, for example, a poem about the Lucky Dragon incident, about there was one fisherman in Japan, I think it goes. But here I want to just present one poem, which is really, I mean, I have the Turkish original, but you can just read the English translation, which quite interestingly has been made into a very famous folk song by the folk singer Pete Seeger. And several other bands have actually, does anybody know this song? No? You know the song? I come and stand at every door. Yeah, so basically, but very, very, very few people know that it was written by Nazım. And I mean, let's just quickly read it. I come and stand at every door, but no one hears my silent tread. I knock and yet remain unseen. For I am dead, for I am dead. I'm only 7, although I died in Hiroshima long ago. I'm 7 now, as I was then. When children die, they do not grow. Again, a dead girl, a ghost of the dead girl, who is imploring the world to have peace. And the final, lines are, so that the children of this world may live and grow and laugh and play. I prefer a more literal translation, which goes like, so that the children are not killed and they can also eat some sweets. I think this is a bit sweeter than this one. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up now to mention some critiques of historians. So historians of Japan have pointed out that Grave of the Fireflies, while it's very poignant, it's very sad, it's a beautiful story, it also diverts attention from Japan's victimizing in Asia. So Sabine Frühstück, for example, writing about what she calls moral authority of innocence, critiques the fact that children have been enlisted, their emotional capital has been enlisted to talk about war. And in a way, I do agree with that, but at the same time, I hope that the lesson that we learn from Grave of the Fireflies, as well as the wider history of children's victimhood in Japan or elsewhere, teaches valuable lessons about humanity, lessons which, unfortunately, the world never seems to learn as bombs continue to rain down on children, whether it's in Ukraine or Gaza. So I'll stop here and we will have a few minutes of a round table. Thank you. My question to my colleagues is, What is the role of war in your teaching and research, very briefly?
Well, it's a good question. In my case, I try to avoid war because I think that there's so much more to say about Japan and Japanese history that is not necessarily related to war. I'm talking about my research. So I did look at some military adventures of Japan overseas, particularly the but so what I was trying to say is that in my research in particular, I try to go away from war because I think there is a lot said about it, which is obviously very important and interesting, but there is so much more beside it. But I did look at, as I said earlier, the voice of the people who are not always considered, and the voice of soldiers is not always considered in some conflicts at least. And so I studied the voice of soldiers who were sent to Siberia in the 1980, from 1918 to 1922, which is the Siberian intervention, a conflict that is not very often talked about, but that is quite important if you look at the interwar period anyway, the Taisho period, which is my focus of interest. So my teaching, well, I have to teach war because it's part of the history of modern Japan, but it's not the whole story. That's, if that makes sense to say something like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm in the opposite position. So I can't really avoid war. For me, to borrow Van Clausewitz's famous term, war is the continuation of politics by other means, and I'm teaching international politics. So it's absolutely central. But one of the great things about teaching Japan's international relations is that Japan is an anomaly in the way in which it not only has prosecuted wars, but also, particularly in the more recent decades, avoided war. And so Japan is a nice case of how it's not just material power that dominates the international system, but actually a lot of other kinds of soft power, smart power, cultural power, and other kinds of influences that can shape international relations. Although I have to say, on a slightly sad note, 10 years ago and more, I was asked to deliver a talk on Japan as a peace state, and I felt a little bit uncomfortable, but I did it. Now, if I was asked to give a lecture on Japan as a peace state, I would probably have to refuse. So there's a lot there.
Thank you. Yeah, in my class, I'm approach war and the peace, war, not too much strongly as a political topic, but as a question of cultural memory and visual expression. So normally we studied how Japanese artists have represented war from official battle painting, which I show you couple, and for example of the 1940s. 1940s to post-war work that's mourn and they reflect. As an art historian and also practice of art history, so we also analyzing visual images, and the student learn how art mirrors the changing value of society, and also how beauty can serve power, but also become a language of empathy and the remembrance as well. Yeah.
Hi there. So I sort of in two camps here, because for my first year undergraduate seminar, which touches on Japanese literature, it figures very little. I mean, it's just a sort of in terms of the fact that the reforms in the immediate post-war period really affected women's ability to attend school, high school, to go to university. in that sense, we look at it as a sort of like breaking, you know, as a historical moment after which there is a drastic change. But in my new module that I'm now sort of teaching, which is a third year undergraduate module in apocalyptic literature, basically, yeah, it figures a lot, because we're looking at scenarios first from British writers who are imagining apocalyptic scenarios. So I look at War of the Worlds, we look at Day of the Triffids, and usually these kind of imaginings of these scenarios are kind of, you know, can be seen within the context of ongoing wars or Britain's colonialization in terms of Wells' War of the Worlds, in terms of the Cold War, when we come to think about Day of the Triffids. And what I've done with my teaching of the module is in the sort of second half of the seminar series, we pivot to look at literature from Japan. And because so many not just British fiction, but global fiction that focuses on the apocalypse, describes scenes of total war, but especially nuclear war. It's very sort of instructive to look at how post-war writers in Japan have described and reimagined those scenes themselves. So I can't really speak too much about it at the moment because I'm just sort of in the middle of teaching the module, and it's still a kind of explorative process for me. But it's yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. Very briefly about my research and teaching. War is really important, unfortunately, for our teaching of Japan, because war is that linchpin, that event that, you know, almost a creation of the new Japan, kind of an event that is at the inception of modern Japan as we know it. For me, the war is important in highlighting the social history of Japan, in highlighting not only the history of the emperors and the new emperor, the MacArthurs of this world, and Trumans and Stalins. It's also important in highlighting the war experiences and post-war experiences of the ordinary people, which Grave of the Fireflies actually is one illustration of children or adults, people whose lives were inevitably affected by the war, by the fire bombings, by the nuclear bombings, but also by the peace. And one thing that I try to cover in my teaching and in my research is that the war experiences of the nation, which inevitably the nation state is always at the center of the war efforts. And even in the film, if you watch it, you will, even in domestic situations, you will see people actually talking about sacrifice. I mean, without spoiling too much, there is one character, an antagonist in the film, who keeps telling the children that they're not doing enough for the nation. While my children work hard, you are just eating. Obviously against the backdrop of food shortages in Japan at the time. So the nation will always claim your life and your limb and come at you and will try to recruit you. First your living body, if it can, and then of course if you die in the war, if you happen to die in the war, then your name will become or your life will become one number added to this toll. And as the historian of victimhood and the person who coined the term victimhood nationalism, Professor Ji-Hyun Lim, writes that nations then will engage in competition, and whoever has the bigger number of victims then will claim that they are the biggest victim. And I think when we look at the history of the war, we need to really keep in mind the fact that we are all basically soldiers of the nation state, whether we want it or not. And thankfully, the world wars are the thing of the past, or at least I hope they are the thing of the past. and we will continue to use the war in a classroom setting and hopefully not have to deal with it in our daily lives. So I think we have about 15 minutes, 14 minutes left. I think this might be, if you all agree, if the organizers agree, and if my colleagues agree, we might use this 14 minutes or so to take some questions from the audience, and including the online audience.
I mean, I think just sort of reading the critical discourse around it, there are so many different ways to interpret the film, and it has. And sorry, this is a very sort of wishy-washy answer then. But I suppose, you know, it can be infuriating for writers and creators when their films are appropriated by political figures for, you know, point scoring. And so I kind of understand their need to push back against specific, definitive interpretations. And I think just sort of more broadly, I see that with, you know, all Japanese writers and creators in the post-war moment is that they, and this includes women, avoid for many years afterwards affiliating themselves with sort of certain political idealisms, including feminism. I think that's particularly striking for Japanese women's literature. And this is a bit of a tangent, but it's also true of men. I mean, I think there are many male writers in the post-war moment as well. And what's interesting about them is that they have, you know, up until the war and during the war, you know, wartime period, you know, of course, they have very sort of striking political leanings and philosophies, and this also becomes a big debate among them in the post-war period. But I think in one sense they resonate. And that's what's really interesting. Even, say, a very right-wing writer like Yukio Mishima, his short stories might resonate with sort of very left-wing writers in this moment, in terms of sort of really reflecting on the war and trying to find a way, you know, towards a vision, a future for Japan. I think particularly this film, you know, it came out in 88, and the novel of 67. These are actually still very fragile moments for Japan in terms of defining itself politically and finding a path. So sorry, that's a really tangential. If anyone else has a better answer.
Okay, so as an art historian, so let's imagine this film as an art. Okay, yeah. So probably it's a Takahata. Yeah, if we think about this one art rather than anti-war film, maybe this film can humanize history, right? So by focusing on the Hotaru is a small and the fragile leaves, and by showing seeing a single light in the darkness, and probably can stand for empathy or peace. Probably that can be possible to, you know, interpretation on behalf of Takahata, but I'm not 100% sure. But what do you think?
Yeah, it's a hospital pass, right there. Yeah, I'm really not sure about Takahata. I was just going to note that you know, it's also interesting, of course, that it's housed within Studio Ghibli, and of course, it's not a Miyazaki Hayao film per se, but it's worth bearing in mind that Miyazaki is fiercely anti-war. So there's a little bit, you know, sorry to be such a politician, but there's a little bit of a Nixon in China effect, in the sense that Takahata can kind of, you know, direct that film under the guises of Ghibli, and it be kind of sitting somehow within an anti-war camp. So I think, yeah, that also illustrates how ridiculous it is that films like Hotaru no Haka get accused of somehow glorifying or transforming Japan's identity into the victim, because that's clearly not what the film is designed to do. I understand that it's maybe obfuscating some of Japan's wrongdoings, but that I think when you start to politicize, then you start to invade on all of that artistic freedom. So I think that's a misreading really of the film.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a fascinating topic. And yeah, please join us, lecture. Well, it's yeah, because of very limited time, I just pick up some representative image as well. So yeah, just a moment, it's my flagging. Well, it's not smooth transition, I must admit. And basically, it's where you base and what kind of experience artists done quite different. And also, yeah, so it's a really shortcut showing some film. But for example, after war, like briefly I mentioned Maruki Toshiiri, she painted massive, almost mural type of battle. It's a Hiroshima panel based on the Maruki Iri's experience or his relatives die and suffer in a Hiroshima bomb. And then not only the later, they also came to Okinawa and the serious field work, and based on the hearing, and they made the Battle of Okinawa mural as well. But not only Maruki Ritoshi and much more small local artists based in Okinawa or Nagasaki, and not only that, Tokyo or anywhere, painted war theme subject matter as well. So yeah, it's not smooth transition. Yeah, but I think it depends on the area, times, and so much subject matter. Of course, don't forget we have to pay attention that not only Japanese artists, but also East Asian or other Asian artists as well. So this one is a massive topic and quite difficult to summarize.
I think I can talk about peace happily. So I think there is a life cycle in a sense. Yes, you could describe it as that. International relations, as Sherzod mentioned, is about competition between nation states, and what tends to transpire is an attempt to dress power politics in morality. And for Japan, because it had such a comprehensive transformation in the post-war era in so many respects, everything from the social, the economic, the security, all of these areas, it was an opportunity to rejuvenate. In that sense, I guess it is like a life cycle, but it was an attempt to rejuvenate, but also to rebrand and reframe that nation state. And to Japan's credit, it did so in a very positive and peace-focused way. And if you go to a Japanese primary school or a Japanese junior high school today, peace is a very powerful part of education and part of national identity. But it was partly as a response to capitulation in terms of power, and peace has become a tool for power. And that's why I say now I would feel very uncomfortable. In fact, I wouldn't really be able to give a lecture on Japan as a peace state, because its stage if we call it a life cycle, its stage in that life cycle is now heading back towards something which is much more conflict prone.
I think the short stories we've been looking at this week that were really interesting, there was Kono Taiko's Iron Fish is one of my favorites. Ibuse Masuji, who is sort of referenced, Black Rain was one of my first encounters with Japanese literature. It's an amazing novel. It's beautifully sort of, and very, you know, well crafted. Anyway, I won't go on. That's really brilliant. But he also wrote several short stories which are fascinating, including The Crazy Iris. There's so many others, but they're a little bit more obscure. Toshio Shimao's Everyday Life in a Dream is, though, I think probably one of the best examples of that kind of literature. It's incredible. Okay.
Thanks, Hannah. I think you recommended 4. I will keep it to 2. I mean, again, let's not worry about one, recommending one. So I will recommend one historic work, one work of fiction. I suspect many of you will have already read both of them, but if not, then I will be happy. So the first one is a book that sold won National Book Award, Pulitzer Prize, but sold more in Japan, many times more than in the United States. Is John W. Dower's Embracing Defeat. And I recommend this book specifically because it's been, the question asks for histories or books about coming to terms. And that book is exactly that, coming to terms with defeat and kind of embracing it and not really rejecting it. And the fiction book that I would recommend, and arguably, or according to me, the best novel written by the author, it's Wind Up Bird Chronicle by Murakami Haruki, and it's I'm sure you will have read it, which is his most historic of novels, and I really I mean, I can't recommend that enough. So if you haven't read it, give it a try.
Well, you took my choice about post-war. All historians know that John Dower, Embracing Defeat, is the book. But I'm going to recommend 2 things. One is the other Murakami, is Murakami Ryu, who wrote Coin Locker Babies, which is you know, an account of post-war that is actually very, very interesting. But I'm going to recommend a filmmaker that I think we don't talk enough of, and it's Imamura Shohei, who's produced so many wonderful movies about post-war, even both documentaries and fiction. And if you have any chance to look at these movies, I just highly recommend it, to give you a feel of what Japan in the post-war was like.
Thank you. I'm going to recommend a book which is also an award-winning book that covers an area of Japan's immediate post-war history, which is very rarely covered. It's by Harvard University Press. It's called 11 Winters of Discontent. And you might spot the author in this room.
Sherzod. Yeah. And also, I would like to recommend Rad's Okinawa book published last year. I'm honestly, strongly recommend. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm strongly recommend you both.
Hello, I'm Akiko Tomatsuri, Associate Professor in Japanese Language and Translation at the University of East Anglia. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person today. So, having explored the world of Japanese studies through the film Grave of the Fireflies from so many different perspectives, you may now be wondering whether it's a good idea to learn Japanese. Don't you think it would be nice to understand the film in its original language and context? For example, Eriko mentions the dual meaning of the term hotaru, falling fire or fireflies. And the way the girl in the trailer we watched used language could also convey in her character's vulnerability and innocence, as well as her feelings and situation. So linguistic analysis is another subject of study you could definitely explore, and learning the language would help us develop a deeper understanding of Japanese culture and society. So it's a bit going far from war and peace, a bit practical information. The University of East Anglia offers a Japanese degree course and Japanese for everyone. So this is information for maybe sixth form students if you're there. But our degree course has 3 pathways, one for total beginners, so you can start from scratch, and one's for those who have completed their GCSEs and A-levels. And students must study in Japan in their 3rd year, choosing one of our 18 partner universities. As well as a degree, our university language program also offers daytime Japanese courses for students and evening course for the public. So there are some opportunity to learn the language. Thanks to its vibrant community of Japan enthusiasts, like those who are there today, including students and staff, I believe that our university really offers an exceptional environment in which to study Japanese studies and Japanese. So we hope everyone will be really inspired to explore this subject further. Thank you very much.